My name is Nathan Cole. I am 52 years old, living a quieter life than anything I ever knew during my 2 decades in the Navy. Out at sea, some days are calm, some days break wild, and if you spend enough years out there, you learn how not to let the waves swallow you whole. I left the service with a back that was still straight and a mind still steady enough, then stepped into offshore energy like it was the most natural next chapter. When you have spent half your life surrounded by wind and water, working with massive structures anchored deep under the ocean does not feel foreign at all. I have been a risk negotiation specialist at Peak Line Energies for almost 10 years. The job sounds dry, but to me, it is familiar terrain. Calculations, precision, managing the variables most people swear cannot be managed. I am not young enough to chase spotlights anymore, but I am seasoned enough to sense an undercurrent before it hits. And this deal with Norway's Fjordnex, worth $1.2 billion, was the kind of water where the smallest misstep could drown everything. Fjordnex is a serious outfit. They do not care for big promises or loud theatrics. They like numbers, humility, and people smart enough to know when to keep quiet. Maybe that is why we always worked well together. Every negotiation before this one had been smooth. No surprises, no drama, no overpowering cologne or inflated speeches. But that started changing the moment Peak Line brought in a new face. His name was Elliot Rourke, 38, praised as a restructuring prodigy, the kind who could turn PowerPoint slides into lifeboats for sinking projects. Elliot was brilliant, no denying that. But he was brilliant in the way people are when they believe they are the brightest person in any room. A brand of intelligence, heavy on confidence, light on real-world mileage, and bursting with the conviction that everyone had held him back for far too long. At our very first meeting in Oslo, I saw a piece of who he truly was. The conference room was wide, framed by tall glass panels overlooking slow-moving traffic below. The typical Nordic gray hung over the city like a sheet of cold steel. Across the table sat the Fjordnex team, quiet, perceptive, impossible to fool. I had worked with them long enough to know when something irritated them, even if their faces barely moved. When one of their engineers asked Elliot about a technical term related to subsea anchor foundations, he answered immediately without thinking. The problem was that the answer was wrong, fundamentally wrong, dangerous wrong. The kind of wrong that does not just reveal you do not understand the subject, but that you do not even realize you do not understand it. For a few seconds, the room tightened. No dramatic reaction, just a subtle shift. The raised eyebrow of the Fjordnex lead engineer. The kind of reaction polite people give when a hot cup of tea hits absolute silence. I could not let the meeting skid off. Like that. I leaned forward slightly, spoke in a calm tone the way an adult corrects an equation written with too much confidence. I said the terminology did not fit the context, then gave a brief, clear explanation. No judgment, no sting. I did not look at Elliot while speaking. No need to embarrass him in front of our partners, but I heard his inhale, the sharp one from someone who has just been pulled back into the right lane, yet feels like someone stepped on his pride. Fjordnex nodded. The meeting moved on. Everything seemed fine, but I knew the Norwegians had long memories, especially for mistakes born from overconfidence. I glanced at Elliot as we left the room. His eyes were bright, but not in the way I like to see in young professionals. It was the brightness of someone used to winning with words instead of facts. He thanked me, but without sincerity, like he believed I had ruined a performance he was sure would be written into the minutes as his personal triumph. I did not respond. Silence can be the most accurate test of someone's character. That night, I walked down to the shoreline behind the hotel. Cold wind hit my face, the waves thudding in steady rhythms like the ocean's giant heartbeat. Oslo at night is quiet. Ships sat anchored in stillness, yellow lights dancing across the dark water. I stood there for a long time, hands still cold after a long day, and realized the unease in me was not coming from the deal. It was coming from Elliot. I had seen men like him before. In the military, they were the ones who entered training believing they could rewrite the laws of physics. The ones who only learned lessons after creating a mess big enough to choke the whole unit. I did not know what kind of mess Elliot would create in the days ahead, but I knew one thing for certain. The A storm in that meeting room this morning That was just the first breeze. And if you are watching this story, drop a comment and tell me where you are tuning in from. I want to know which corners of America this journey has reached. I have always believed that to understand a person, sometimes you have to step backward into the place they once stood. For me, that means returning to my years in the Navy, where the wind carried a metallic taste, the seawater was not always blue, and every decision balanced between life and death instead of profit and key performance indicators. I joined the Navy at 20, not out of some grand ideal, but because I needed direction, and I trusted the ocean to teach me things the land never could. The ocean taught me far more than I expected. I learned how to read the rhythm of the wind, how to look at a single cloud and predict the heart of a storm, how to read the eyes of a teammate to know whether they were calm or simply pretending. My youth passed in patrols, long watches, and bone-cold nights when northern winds sliced the air like knives. I left the service with a rank respectable enough for others to listen and a clarity just strong enough to know I could not live my entire life between salt and steel. Offshore energy came to me naturally. When you have spent half your life understanding the true weight of the wind, you realize those giant turbines out in the ocean are not just machines that generate electricity. They are proof that humans can work with nature instead of wrestling against it. Wow. I joined Peak Line Energies like a man ready to use my old experience to solve new problems. And for many years, everything flowed like a steady current. I remember clearly the accident offshore 3 years ago when my team and I had to handle a failure in the anchoring system of a turbine station near the edge of the North Sea. A sudden storm snapped a secondary support pillar, sending the whole structure into a dangerous sway. A few more hours and the entire cluster could have collapsed, causing financial losses and a chain of legal crises with the Norwegian authorities. I was standing on the deck of a small vessel watching a steel column weighing hundreds of tons bend like a fishing rod in a gale, and I had minutes to decide whether we could move fast enough to save it. We did, not because I was better than anyone else, but because I knew the wind is often stronger than it appears. I chose a solution that was bold but safe, calculating the angle for the auxiliary anchors based on the direction the wind was about to shift. The structure held until the storm died. The next day, a Fjordnex executive called to tell me they trusted me from that moment on. Not because I had saved a turbine, but because I understood the wind. In this industry, understanding the wind means understanding the true nature of risk. My life in Maine is the complete opposite of everything I once knew. A small wooden cabin by the coast where the floorboards still creak each morning as I walk in. I brew coffee in an old kettle, open the window to let the breeze in, and listen to the waves like a reminder that the most important things happen quietly. When I am not traveling. For work, I fix small wooden pieces, read books, or walk through the pine forest near my home. At my age, quiet is not loneliness. It is a reward. While I live simply and steadily, Elliot operates in the opposite direction. He likes crowded meetings, colorful slides, and bold visions without the grounding numbers behind them. An internal workshop under Elliot could make you think you were attending a tech product launch instead of working with multi-ton offshore equipment. Elliot believes confidence alone can convince people. I believe only understanding can. A few days after the meeting in Oslo, an older engineer from the operations team approached me while we were waiting for our flight home. He sat beside me like a man who had wanted to speak for a long time, but had only just gathered the courage. He told me Elliot had been discussing with several executives about removing me from the project. The reasons felt familiar, almost predictable. Restructuring, team rejuvenation, needing someone with a fresh vision. I had heard the same excuses in the military whenever someone wanted to replace a person without admitting the real motive. I simply nodded, no reaction. That is probably what frustrates people the most about me. I rarely raise my voice, rarely slam a table, and rarely give immediate opinions. Instead, I observe, quietly, watching how people move, how they speak, the accidental silences between their words. Someone who has lived through storms is not easily intimidated by a gust of wind, but the clearest sign arrived one morning when I opened my email. Elliot had sent a message to the entire project group announcing that from now on, he would personally lead the technical negotiations with Fjordnex. He wrote it in a way that made me look like someone who had handed off incomplete information, a subtle jab designed to tell everyone he wanted control. I finished reading and smiled, a smile without joy or anger, just confirmation of what I had already sensed. Elliot had officially opened the real conflict between us, a conflict I knew had nothing to do with the $1.2 billion deal, but everything to do with his belief that I was the shadow he needed to outrun. I have met many kinds of wind in my life, but the aggressive wind Elliot carried did not come from nature. It came from the ego. An ego, when it blows too hard, usually folds in on itself before it ever manages to hurt anyone else. The contract closing meeting that morning unfolded in the kind of atmosphere only Northern Europe seems to master. Quiet, formal, precise enough to make you straighten your posture the moment you sit down. The glass room overlooked Oslo, washed in a soft gray, and the Fjord Next team was already seated, silent and focused as always. I knew their style well. No circling around, no theatrics. They asked only what mattered and listened to every detail that did. I took my usual seat, opened the documents, ready to do what I do best, bridging two completely different ways of thinking while keeping the negotiation in rhythm. But from the first few minutes, I felt a faint tension at the edge of the table. Not because the partners were difficult, but because Elliot Rourke was trying too hard to make an impression. He leaned back in his chair, always searching for a moment to drop a line that sounded important. A kind of eagerness in all the wrong places. When the Fjord Next chief engineer asked about the backup system in case of a sudden wind shift, I was preparing to answer, but Elliot jumped in half a beat too fast. He spoke with full confidence, throwing out a string of impressive-sounding terms that did not actually address the issue. A half measure for a question that allowed no half measures. The engineer looked at me. Just a glance, but I understood it instantly. I waited for Elliot to finish, then gently stepped in, corrected the information, and laid out the correct approach. I kept my voice calm, just dry enough for those paying attention to notice the contrast, but not sharp enough to embarrass him. The room settled back into its steady rhythm, but Elliot did not stop. He cut in several more times, each one stretching the answers longer than they needed to be or drifting off the point entirely. The Fjord Next team began exchanging looks. I knew those looks. They were assessing who in the room actually understood the work. Then the meeting reached its most critical section, assigning responsibility for offshore legal incidents. A single misplaced phrase here could send the entire project into a long, expensive legal spiral. I opened the document and pointed to the clause we needed to finalize. I had just begun explaining when Elliot leaned back, wearing that familiar, confident smile. He proposed using a more vague phrase to increase flexibility. The problem was that in the context of North Sea regulations, that phrase was the equivalent of leaving the door unlocked without checking who might walk in. I was about to correct it when Elliot suddenly shifted his tone. He turned to the Fjord Next team and announced that Peak Line would soon implement a major personnel change. He said I would no longer be part of the project, that Peak Line was refreshing the team, and that this change was necessary for the company's new strategy. It all happened in seconds, but the room felt compressed. No one nodded, no one smiled, no one asked a follow-up. Only the heavy, quiet of people who recognized something delivered at the wrong time for the wrong reason. I looked at Elliot. I was not angry. I had seen plenty of people cut their own hands without realizing how sharp the blade was. This was one of those moments. I asked softly, "Are you sure you want to announce that right now?" Elliot answered with smug confidence. He used all the familiar words: transparency, innovation, strategy. He believed this was his moment of authority, the moment everyone in the room would see him as the new lead. I turned to the Fjord Next team. "I apologize for the disruption," I said. "It seems Peak Line has chosen a restructure in the middle of finalizing this deal. I just want to make one thing absolutely clear." I paused for a single beat. "You just removed the only person who knows how to keep this deal from sinking." I did not raise my voice. I did not mock him. I stated it like a simple fact, and that was exactly what made the room fall even quieter. Elliot opened his mouth, searching for a rebuttal, but stopped halfway. There was no response he could give without making himself look worse. I did not wait. I gathered my documents. neat and calm. No rush, no anger. It was that calmness that unsettled him the most. I walked toward the door, feeling the eyes behind me. Not pity, not shocked, but recognition. They had just witnessed a very large mistake. The meeting room door closed behind me, a soft click. But for Elliot, it was probably the signal of something he had not yet understood. He had not just removed me from the project. He had cut away the only bridge that the $1.2 billion deal needed to stand. And I simply walked on, carrying the silence of a man who knows the real storm has only just begun. I left Oslo on a late flight. No one saw me off, no one called, not a single explanation from Peak Line. It was the kind of silence a former military man like me understands well. Silence not because people forget you, but because they hope time will make the wound less obvious. I sat by the window watching the darkening waters of the North Sea below, reminding myself that some waves are not meant to be fought. You simply let them pass. When the plane touched down in Maine, the sky had already turned black. The air at home carried the familiar mix of pine resin and salt, a scent I had never once found unpleasant. I drove back to my wooden cabin, turned on the warm kitchen light, brewed a cup of coffee, and sat at the old oak table I had built myself. Everything was quiet in that northeastern way, the way only an American coastal town can be. Wind is slipping through the window frame. Waves are hitting the shore in the distance. The sense that everything was exactly where it needed to be, even when it was not what you wanted. But what people did not know was that I had been preparing for this moment for 3 months. The day Elliot was appointed project lead, I had already seen that brand of young ambition too many times. I knew two men like us would not coexist peacefully for long. So I established Cole Maritime Strategies, a small company, fully registered, an independent offshore risk consulting practice. No announcements, no statements, nothing on any social network. Just a clean legal file, a small monthly office lease, a separate email address, and every document needed to operate the instant I had to. By the time Peak Line removed me in the middle of a meeting, I was not surprised at all. And because Elliot was too impulsive, everything unfolded more smoothly than I expected. Peak Line did not ask me to sign anything when they cut me from the project. No non-disclosure agreement, no non-compete, no exit paperwork, not even an official memo. They simply disabled my access and let Elliot announce it verbally in front of the client, as if it were some kind of personal victory. In the corporate world, that is the fastest way to break yourself. I had no intention of exploiting anything. But the law is the law, and I have lived my whole life believing caution is not a luxury. When a large company forgets to lock its back door, the person walking out is not the one at fault. 2 days after I left Oslo, my phone buzzed. A number from Norway. It was the project director at Fjordnex. He spoke directly. Peak Line was unstable, and they did not have the time to wait for a new team to relearn what I had spent nearly a year building. He asked if I would be willing to consult independently for them. No long-term commitment, no political pressure, just focusing on the risk and technical structure needed to keep the deal moving. I stayed silent for a few seconds before answering. I said I would accept, but under 2 conditions. 1, I would not approach anyone still working at Peak Line. 2, I would not participate in any plan designed to put Peak Line in trouble. I do not care for loud revenge. It makes people smaller. The Fjordnex director said only one thing. You are the reason we trusted this project from the beginning. We want to keep that reason. After agreeing, I turned off the phone and stood for a moment by the window. The sea was dark, steady, unhurried. I had been through enough storms to know that silence usually signals big changes, but this time the silence felt clean. I began working. At first, just a few documents, a few emails, a few technical exchanges, but the more I worked, the clearer it became that Peak Line was losing direction so quickly that I did not need to do anything for it to show. The next day, an email from Elliot arrived. Subject, legal warning. I opened it. It was a threat letter about possible litigation if I negatively affected Peak Line's negotiation process. The problem was that the letter was rushed, full of missing punctuation, lacked a legal basis, and even cited the wrong clause from my old contract. It read like someone who had taken a 2-hour corporate law crash course and thought a handful of serious-sounding phrases could scare someone. I did not reply. There was no need. I knew Elliot too well. The kind of man who thinks volume equals strength. But I have met enough waves to know the truth. The harder the wind blows, the faster it tires. People like Elliot spend too much energy on things that do not need force at all. I set my phone down, poured a fresh cup of coffee, and went back to work. I thought about my own boundaries. I was not pulling people from Peakline. I was not sabotaging the company. I was not spreading rumors. I was doing exactly what the client needed, nothing more. That boundary was for myself, not for Peakline. My silence, as I knew, had far more weight than any argument, and that silence irritated Elliot even more. I did not need to beat him. I only needed to stand still long enough for him to realize he was sinking into the hole he had dug for himself. As for me, I kept moving forward, quiet, unbothered. Maybe that is the one thing people like Elliot will never understand. The power of someone who has nothing left to prove. I returned to Maine with a rhythm so quiet it was hard to believe that only a few days earlier, I had been fired in the middle of a $1.2 billion negotiation. Every morning I woke before sunrise, brewed a cup of black coffee, opened the window to let the ocean wind in, and sat at the old oak desk I had built years ago. The small cabin had nothing remarkable in it, but it gave me exactly what I needed. No noise, no meetings, no ambition from people who thought they had done something grand when all they had done was create chaos. From that simple desk, I began my work with Fjordnex in complete silence. They sent me the documents that needed restructuring, each file heavy, each page full of corrections Peakline had placed in all the wrong spots. I read every line, marked what was missing, what was wrong, and sent back a clean version. Never long, never embellished, just clear enough that anyone reading it would understand what actually mattered. I did not need to prove anything. The people who needed to understand always did on the first read. What struck me was how much faster Fjordnex responded. Maybe after the sudden firing, they would better recognize who truly understood the backbone of the project. Every time they wrote the words "all clear," thanks, I knew things were moving in the right direction. Northern Europeans do not flatter, but they value precision. I worked precisely, and that was enough. While I focused, Peakline began showing the cracks it had created for itself. A former engineer messaged me. No one can explain the wind simulation section. They are digging through your old emails. A short message, no commentary, but enough for me to understand how lost they were. I did not reply, not because I was cold, but because any reply at that moment could be twisted into something I never intended. The second message arrived that afternoon, this time from a subcontractor team. They canceled their meeting with Peakline and sent a letter withdrawing from the project. Their reason: Peakline could not provide accurate technical data. They could not continue without clarity, and the one person who could answer had been crossed off in the middle of a meeting. I did not celebrate. I simply found it logical. When you pull a pillar out of a bridge, you cannot blame the wind for making it shake. Inside Peakline, Elliot began doing what inexperienced people often do. He blocked all communication with me. Every email, message, and technical discussion had to pass through him. He thought this gave him control, but it only pushed the entire team into a deadlock. No one could ask me directly, and he could not answer the questions he believed he understood. This created a strange divide. Peakline was forced to interpret documents I had written but never fully explained, while Fjordnex continued working with me as if this had always been the plan. Two worlds drifted apart, and Elliot stood between them, but not firmly. About a week after, began independent work, a small post appeared on an energy industry forum. Not a scandal, not breaking news, just a question someone tossed into the air. Who actually built the foundation for the Peakline Fjordnex project? Someone else replied, heard the guy who got fired mid-meeting was the one who understood the risk structure. From there, the idea spread like an underground stream. The strange part was that I did not have to say anything. Silence created a space where people connected the dots on their own. While Peakline wrestled with internal confusion, I kept my focus. At the end of the day, I walked around the cabin, breathed in the cold air, and then returned to my desk to review the models again. Fjordnex relied on me to stabilize the core, and I had no reason to treat that lightly. The only line I held firmly was the ethical one. Several former colleagues asked if I was hiring, if I had open roles. They said they wanted to leave Peakline. I understood the feeling, but I said no. I had not built a company to become a shelter for people running from someone else. I wanted the people who chose my path because they believed in it, not because they feared another. One afternoon, while I was reviewing data, Fjordnex sent a short message. Your documents are clearer than what Peakline has sent in the last 3 months. I read it and simply smiled. Not out of satisfaction, just relief. Across the ocean, Peakline scrambled through a maze of emergency meetings. Elliot organized a crisis session to fix communication issues, as a former colleague told me. I did not need more details to know it was the kind of meeting where people try to cover a 1-meter crack with a strip of bandage. I continued working the same way, with the steady sound of waves outside the window. No punches thrown, no public retaliation, no dramatic revenge. My counterattack, if you could call it one, was simply doing the job Peakline believed they no longer needed me for. I was not trying to defeat Peakline. I had taken a different road. Peakline chose to walk into a dead end. I did not close that door. Elliot did. And me. I simply kept my rhythm, like the sea, like the wind. No noise, but enough force to change the course of a ship. From my small wooden cabin in Maine, everything looked peaceful. But nearly 5,000 kilometers away, Peakline was drifting like a ship without a rudder in the middle of a storm. I did not need anyone to explain. Just watching how they behaved over the past week told me everything. A company loses one person, and if that person is the one the entire project structure leans on, that loss is enough to make the already loose machinery start shaking immediately. The first message came from an old colleague. Just a few words. Meetings nonstop. No one can find direction. I did not reply, but I could picture it clearly. Conference rooms are lit all day. Technical diagrams passed around like mismatched puzzle pieces. The data analyst stared at her screen, pale because the margin of error calculations no longer made sense. Every major project has its own rhythm. Once that rhythm is broken, things start slipping. Peakline did not understand that. Elliot understood it even less. In an attempt to prove he was still in control, Elliot released 3 legal statements back to back, the intent obvious. Accusing me of negatively influencing the deal, claiming I was the reason subcontractors pulled out. I read one of the public statements. The wording was stiff, careless, full of mistakes that made it clear he had written it while trying to hold on to something already slipping from his hands. True attorneys never write statements with that wild stroke of the pen. Right after that, Elliot called the law firm Peakline had worked with for years, trying to pressure them into drafting documents to stop Nathan from interfering. But when the legal team reviewed my file, they discovered what I had known for a long time. Peakline had nothing binding me. No non-disclosure agreement, no non-compete, no exit packet, not even a meeting record. We have nothing to hold him with, the legal representative said. There is no basis for liability. I heard this from an old friend in the legal department. His voice still carried a trace of disbelief. Elliot had pushed the company into this situation himself. A reckless decision made mid-meeting had left a gap any experienced person would have avoided. When the legal team announced the truth in their internal meeting, Elliot stayed silent for a few seconds, a rare thing for him. But the silence was not a reflection. It was the moment of someone realizing they were standing on thinner ice than they thought. Blame was the only reaction he knew. Elliot blamed human resources for not completing the paperwork. He blamed the legal department for not being proactive. He blamed the technical team for relying on Nathan too much. But the more he blamed, the more he revealed his weakness. He did not understand the root of the problem. And when you do not understand the cause, you cannot fix anything. A veteran operations director, someone I had worked with for years, stood up in the busiest meeting of the week and said plainly, Nathan did not cause this mess. The way we handled him did. The words hit the table like an anchor. A few people nodded. Elliot looked around, searching for allies, but no one spoke. The younger employees who had supported him months ago now avoided his eyes like they were avoiding the glare of a harsh sun. In a conference room, silence can be the strongest form of protest. Then came the stock price. People say the market has no emotions, but in truth, it reacts precisely to chaos. When Peakline reported that a subcontractor had withdrawn and that the technical structure needed review, the stock dipped. When internal whispers spread that Fjordnext had not responded to Peakline for 4 days straight, the stock dropped further. Investors started calling the office. Why did the head of risk structure disappear? A simple question. No one could answer it. In the energy industry news circuit, when people cannot find an official answer, they start asking public questions. A major outlet in Texas posted a short piece. Peakline risk specialist leaves the project. Coincidence or signal? A technical magazine in Norway asked directly, why was the lead specialist removed in the middle of a meeting? These questions did not accuse anything, but they stirred the waters. What Peakline feared most finally happened. Fjordnext completely stopped responding. No meeting confirmations, no email replies, no acknowledgement. A refined silence typical of Northern Europeans when they want to signal that trust has been lost. Someone from Peakline's legal team even tried calling the Fjordnext director directly. The call rang, then went to voicemail. And that was the moment Peakline understood that losing a contract was not the worst scenario. The worst scenario was losing trust, something no amount of money could buy back. While Peakline scrambled, I sat in my cabin, the window open for the sea wind to come through. My workday continued as usual, reviewing data, writing reports, discussing technical updates with the Fjordnext team. No one mentioned Peakline. No one asked what I thought about the situation. We only talked about the work. To me, this was not a war. I was not standing on opposite sides. I was simply doing the job I was hired to do, fairly, transparently, and in the full scope of my expertise. But even if I did not want a war, Peakline was shooting itself in the foot over and over. I understood more clearly than ever. Elliot was not afraid of losing the contract. He was afraid of losing the image of a brilliant young leader he had built for himself. That was why he pushed harder, held more meetings, and sent more legal letters. All to prove that things were still under his control. But everyone saw the truth. He was trying to prop up a ship that was already leaning. And me. I stayed here in my old wooden house, working with people who respected the work. No noise, no display. Silent, but never standing still. I arrived in Bergen on a clear morning, the kind of rare brightness in the North Sea when the clouds finally give the sun a little space. The city sat between mountains and water, beautiful in a way that could fool you into thinking it was not a place where billion-dollar conversations happened. But the topic of the meeting mattered less than the people sitting at the table. And that day, I knew the room would reveal more truths than any contract ever could. Fjordnext invited me to finalize the agreement. No ceremony, no polished phrases, just a simple message. We need you in Bergen. Everything is ready for the final step. I understood them. This was the stage where no more mistakes could be tolerated. They wanted the person who built the foundation standing at the center, not the one who tried to force himself in at the last minute. I arrived at their headquarters a little early, a glass and steel building facing the Bergen Harbor, with rows of quiet boats, though I knew the air inside would be much sharper. I was reviewing a section of the proposal when the receptionist approached and informed me that a team from Peakline had just arrived. I was not surprised. I simply asked, "Who is leading them?" She answered, "Elliot Rourke." A part of me had expected that. When a ship is sinking, the one desperate to prove he is still the captain will always be the last to jump ashore. Peakline was losing direction, and under pressure from the board, Elliot would certainly try to reclaim some control by showing up where he believed he still had authority. The Peakline group walked into the lobby minutes after I did. Elliot saw me, hesitated for half a second, then adjusted his tie as if a neat knot could hide an entire month of chaos. I nodded lightly, without intention, without avoidance. A Fjordnext staff member came to greet us. When Elliot tried to step forward to speak, his voice forced into a calm he did not truly feel. The representative politely raised his hand to stop him. "We will begin on time," he said. The tone was not cold, but it was unmistakable. Elliot stepped back half a pace, wearing a smile stretched thin like a sheet of brittle ice. In the hallway to the conference room, Elliot tried small talk with one of the Fjordnext technical directors. I caught the end of it. We could clarify a few details before the meeting. The director answered with a faint smile. I think it is better for everything to be presented in the meeting. More transparent for everyone. In Nordic culture, that was the equivalent of a direct refusal. Elliot stopped, his face darkening slightly, though he forced himself to walk on with confidence. The meeting room was wide with high ceilings, the air carrying a light scent of pine, a signature Scandinavian touch. I sat in the seat marked for me. The Fjordnext team spread out the documents, everything neat and sharp, their usual precision. The peak line group sat across, Elliot in the center, his eyes revealing tension even as he pretended to be in control. The meeting began normally, with brief greetings and confirmation of the final points. I presented the latest updates, adjusted safety standards, new wind risk simulations, and clearly defined legal responsibilities. Fjordnext nodded at each piece. These were the sections we had built together for weeks. Then Elliot decided to test his luck again. As soon as I finished the section on the auxiliary anchor system, he slid a stack of documents toward the Fjordnext director. The movement was quick, subtle in intention, but obvious enough for everyone to notice. I believe this version reflects the original intent more accurately, he said with a slight smile. I looked down and recognized it immediately. The modified peak line draft meant to cut costs, the same one Fjordnext had rejected 2 months earlier. Just seeing the title told me Elliot was desperately trying to salvage something, or simply had no idea where to begin defending himself. But before the director could open it, his assistant stepped forward. This is not the version we are reviewing, she said, her voice light but firm. Elliot tried to hold his composure. I only wanted to make sure we considered every option. The director looked at him. Not angry, not annoyed, just the expression of someone who had already made a decision. We do not need to revisit sections that have already been settled, he said. The air grew heavier. Elliot folded his arms, trying to hide his discomfort. Less than an hour later, Fjordnext paused the meeting. The director stood and said, to avoid misinformation, we request that discussions continue only with the person directly handling the contents of this file. Anything unrelated to the core negotiation team should be addressed afterward. That was their polite way of asking Peak Line to step out. A Fjordnext staff member opened the door and invited the Peak Line group to leave. Elliot stood, his face drawn tight. As he walked past me, he looked at me with none of the confidence he used to carry. No pride, no pretense, only the look of a man realizing the game had moved beyond his reach. The door closed behind them. The room felt noticeably lighter. The Fjordnext team and I returned to the contract. This time, everything flowed effortlessly, no interruptions, no strange edits, no detours. We completed each clause as if placing the final stones on a foundation built correctly from the start. 2 hours later, the final version was done. No vague points, no open-ended terms. Everything is clear, balanced, and built to protect both sides. The contract was not made to win against anyone. It was made to preserve what was right. As we stood to prepare for signatures, I glanced through the thick glass wall. Elliot stood in the hallway, unaware that I saw him. He no longer looked like a victor or a leader. He just stood there, quietly, wearing the expression of someone searching for an explanation to a mistake too large to hide. His eyes did not belong to someone betrayed. They belonged to someone who finally understood he had pushed himself out of the game. The news did not explode like fireworks. It spread like frost, slow, cold, and by the time people noticed, it had covered everything. One morning in Bergen, as I prepared to return to Maine, my phone buzzed nonstop. I did not open it right away. I made coffee first, watched the steam rise, then read each headline. The first article came from an American business outlet. The bold line at the top reads, "Peak Line fails due to poor leadership. No circling around, no excuses, no blaming the market or geopolitical shifts." They pointed straight at internal failures, impulsive decisions, and leadership built on presentations instead of data. There was also a short mention of the meeting in Oslo, where I was removed from the project without any process at all. I read the entire article without seeing my name until the final line, a quiet acknowledgement that this story did not need me to explain anything. Anyone paying attention could see the truth. A few hours later, the Scandinavian press published its piece. Unlike the Americans, they wrote briefly but directly, in their characteristically Nordic way. The $1.2 billion energy contract has been signed with Coal Maritime Strategies. Just one sentence, but enough to send Peakline reeling. A project of that scale moving to an independent consulting firm was unusual. The fact that it was made public so openly was even more unusual. They offered no commentary, no insinuation. But everyone understood. The world now knew who truly kept the deal on course. The news spread so fast that within 24 hours, Peakline's board had to call an emergency meeting. That afternoon, the press reported that Elliot Rourke had been suspended pending an internal review. The article described him arriving at Peakline headquarters and looking dazed, avoiding every question from reporters. Not because he refused to speak, but there was no answer left that could convince anyone. That evening, another newspaper published an anonymous interview with several Peakline employees. A senior engineer said, "We warned leadership. The only person who understood the entire technical structure was Nathan." A younger employee said even more simply, "We were told to follow instructions without asking why." Then a mid-level manager added, "The way they fired him can be summed up in one word: chaos." Peakline tried to control the narrative, but their efforts were like scooping water from a ship with a hole in the hull. More and more people spoke up. No anger, no revenge. They simply described what had happened. And sometimes the truth told plainly is more dangerous than any accusation. By the end of the week, the largest financial network in the United States reported that two major investors had begun pulling out. A company worth billions can withstand a few shocks, but not a collapse in trust. The reports said Peakline stock had fallen sharply, and according to market analysts, the decline could continue. Meanwhile, I returned to Maine as planned. The ocean wind still carried salt and damp wood across the porch. I set my luggage down and reviewed the documents for the coming week. My phone kept lighting up with requests for interviews from major newspapers. Several television networks wanted me to speak about the deal. Others wanted comments on Peakline. Some even asked for my thoughts on leadership. I answered all of them with one line: I do not take interviews. I am focused on my current work. Not because I was avoiding anything. I just refused to put anyone in a difficult situation. I chose silence not out of fear, but because I did not need to speak to prove anything. Years in the military had taught me a simple lesson. Real strength is never loud. I walked to the beach, watching the water shift colors as the sun set. Everything had unfolded faster than I expected, but none of it surprised me. This was not my retaliation. This was the result of decisions Peakline had made on its own. I remembered seeing Elliot in Bergen, standing in the hallway outside the conference room behind that thick pane of glass. Back then, his eyes were full of confusion. Now I imagine they looked different, maybe anxious, maybe afraid. Maybe for the first time, he was finally asking himself how many warnings he had ignored. Whatever he felt, the truth remained unchanged. He was the one who placed the first stone in the chain of collapse. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel satisfaction. I simply watched the sea, arms folded in the wind, and thought that sometimes collapse does not come from a single heavy blow. It comes from the small cracks people refuse to look at. And if anything brought me a sense of peace this time, it was knowing the truth had stepped into the light on its own. I did not have to pull the curtain open for it. That morning in Maine, the air was colder than usual. The sky was brushed with a shade of blue so clear, it looked like you could see straight to the bottom of the ocean if you stared long enough. I set a stack of documents on the old wooden table on my porch, the sand below still marked with my footprints from the walk the night before. The waves kept their steady rhythm, as if they were waiting with me for the moment that would finally close months of storms. The Fjord Next representative called at the exact scheduled time, true to Nordic form. No extra words, no circling around. We are ready to sign. I nodded and opened the official implementation contract. It was not just a $1.2 billion agreement. It was the result of respect, of trust built over the entire process. Trust that grew quietly in the spaces no one tried to disrupt. I signed, then they signed. It ended softly like an exhale, yet carried the weight of a milestone. Strange how the most important moments rarely come with fireworks. They come with a silence that tells you you have chosen the right path. After the call ended, I stood for a few minutes looking down at the signed contract. This was no longer a story of peak line losing or anyone winning. It was the story of a project finally landing in the right hands. I did not feel triumphant. I felt peace, the kind of peace that comes from placing the right piece in the right place. Not long after, I began doing what I always knew I eventually would, building a new deployment team. A small, lean group made of people I trusted in both skill and integrity. No former peak line colleagues. No one is carrying resentment. No one is hoping to use this project to prove anything other than that they intended to do the work right. I called an older engineer I had worked with on a deep sea project in Florida. He asked only one question. "Are we doing this the way we believe is right?" I said. "Yes," he nodded. "I am in." I called a risk specialist in Seattle, someone I once saved from a serious calculation error years ago. After listening in silence for a few seconds, she answered, "I like the way you work. I will fly to Maine." I did not choose many people, only those who understood that integrity is not a slogan. It is the rule that guides every decision. When the news of the contract spread, a major investment fund reached out. They proposed a long-term partnership, offering financial backing to help me expand Cole Maritime Strategies into an international strategic consulting firm. It was an attractive offer, the kind most people would take instantly, but I told them I needed time to think. 3 days later, I gave my answer. I agree, but we expand only when there is a justified reason. No chasing size, no letting money dictate the pace. They paused for a moment, then said, "Then we can work together." In the afternoon, as I stood by the shoreline preparing to call the team with the news, my phone rang. It was my son in Boston. His voice was calm, steady, the kind of steadiness young people only have when they have seen enough to understand more than they admit. "Dad," he said, "I saw the news. You did the right thing." I did not respond immediately. The wind blew into the phone, making a soft hiss like the breath of time. "I am proud of you," he added. "Some words do not need to be long. They just need to arrive at the right moment." I sat on the wooden steps, looking at the sea stretching out before me. In that moment, I understood that every decision I had made, from walking out of that room in Oslo to staying silent in Maine, to refusing to retaliate, had led to one single outcome. I did not lose myself. I rested my hands on my knees and said the sentence that many people spend their whole lives trying to learn. Justice does not need noise. It only needs to stand in its rightful place. The sea stayed the same, deep, honest, like a person stripped of every outer layer except the part that cannot be changed. I looked up at the sky turning soft pink as the day faded, another day closing. But for me, it was the beginning of a new journey, a journey without applause, without medals, but with the freedom to do what is right, in the right way, with the right people. And if you have listened this far and felt something in this story, the quiet justice, the steady resolve, or simply the calm of someone choosing integrity, then I have one message for you. If you appreciate stories of silent justice and civilized turnarounds, subscribe to the channel to support what comes next. We are only just getting started.